Good evening. I assume this is working. Last night, as I came to realize that we had reached the incredibly late mark of 10:30, I tended, as I often do tend, to forego any overall conclusion, leaving a beginning somewhat suspended in air. This isn't the worst of all possible things, but I would like to say a word about the form of my discourse last night. I began with a proposition from Wittgenstein that is simply Grammatik als Theologie, the implication of an intimate relationship between the theological and the grammatical, and I proposed that I could deflect that into a discussion of the relationship between narrative and both Grammatik and Theologie, that is, narrative as a form of theology. In order to do so, I posed or sought examples from three different modes of cinematic authority. Kirsanov's form of authority, whereby he controls more than he tells us, where there's a superabundance of knowledge on his part, and that we are rhetorically led to participate in the interpretive activity, and that this superabundance of knowledge on the author's part is tied to a taikistic or chance-developed sense of the narrative, a very traditional sense of the narrative, whereby the characters are precisely what happens to them. That is, certain things happen as if by chance, and the characters are what has happened to them. And that this is tied to a particular mode of authority, and that that mode of authority, superabundance, is tied to a particular rhetoric of filmic construction. I then attempted to show how Bresson, invoking a first-person model with the special paradox of the text in which the author says, I am writing this, and all of the traditional and ideological complications involved in the relationship between writing and acting, doing and saying, doing and representing, implied, tends to involve a completely different theology, and in Bresson's case involved a Jansenist antinomian theology, whereby the character was not at all what happened to him. What happened to him was this fiction he kept on developing until at a certain moment it was suddenly deflected. And then in this tripart argument, I attempted to show how Karl Dreyer consciously and deliberately involved us in a question of authority, continually led us down an authoritative path to disagree with, to find fault with, not to believe the most radical elements within his narrative, that is, the vision of Johannes, to be seduced, as cinema naturally seduces us, into a vision of the actual and the real, and then suddenly he slams the brake on it, and all that we had taken for granted, our very participation in the film as if we were one of the self-righteous and self-assured religious pseudo-religious figures within the film, suddenly breaks down. That in Dreyer's case, the relationship of the cinematic authority of the narrator to what he is narrating is the most conscious, the most deliberate, and the most strategic of all. In short, I attempted to demonstrate that there is, in the very nature of the way in which the author, the fictional author, constructs his film and provides the information for us, piece by piece, an implicit theology. One doesn't have to accept it, but that's what I was trying to do. Today, the issue is somewhat different. It's the film as the mind, or the cinema as a paradigm of consciousness. And one has to move from the European narrative tradition, to focus this point, into the American avant-garde cinema, where that paradigm has been so dominant in the past 30 years. It is the film as mind in movement or in process. The attempt of cinema to come to terms with the way in which the mind operates. Of course, there is no such thing as the universal way in which the mind operates. Each one of the filmmakers will construct for us a model of the mind, will invent a mind, and then show how cinema is uniquely able to participate in the representation of that mind. And the first figure I want to deal with is Harry Smith, a figure who needs some introduction. He's one of the most remarkable men I have ever encountered. I'll tell you a story. Harry Smith's, as far as I'm concerned, the most important filmmaker who worked with animation in the history of cinema. And he is a prodigious animator, made many films, worked years and years on films. I was once in California at some social gathering. I was telling a story about Harry Smith. There was a young woman there who was a concert musician, a folk musician. And she said, that's very funny that there's, that Smith is it must be the commonest English name. Said there's a character named Harry Smith who's almost as nutty as the one you're describing, but he's the great authority on American folk music. And I said, it's the same one, of course. I said, no, it's impossible because of the amount of work he's done. I mean, he's just the titanic authority. And of course, Harry Smith is a figure with a tremendous reputation in American Indian anthropology. He has published many records of Indian rituals. He has perhaps the largest collection of Ukrainian Easter eggs in the world, a very expensive interest. One of the largest collections of symbolical patchwork quilts in the world, an expert on several Indian sign systems, that is, American Indian sign systems. His collection of jazz records is the basis for the New York Public Library's massive jazz collection, and he is one of the heroes of the early Downbeat magazine as a student of jazz. There was an entire rock group that was using his songs, doing new songs, new versions of songs that he had discovered. And in addition to all this, he is a filmmaker. But not really in addition. Harry Smith is a person who is concerned with a medieval and Renaissance tradition and with a theory of universal speech, or even more, a theory of universal sign systems. So for him, music and painting and film are all part of a traditional human effort to define the nature of the mind and the nature of representation. And he's very fond of pointing out that certain cinematic techniques can be found in the hermetic projection systems of John Dee, a British alchemist of the Elizabethan period, or in Robert Fludd, a somewhat later alchemist. And the entire alchemical tradition and the subsequent tradition of the Gesamtkunstwerk all play part of one aesthetic direction for Harry Smith. He is a filmmaker simply because he says that is the most interesting tool at the moment for the making of his films. He is, in a certain way, an alchemist. And in alchemy, there is the theory of the great work. That is the work to which an alchemist devotes himself for his entire life, and which does not necessarily have an end. It is a perversion of alchemy to think of minor league economists trying to turn lead into gold. And when one reads alchemical texts from the Arabian Geber of the Middle Ages on down, one discovers that in order to make the gold, one has to make the proper athanor. And in order to make the athanor, one has to get the proper metals. In order to purify these metals, one has to make the proper metal container. And it's a kind of infinite regression, which ultimately becomes a spiritual exercise. That is, in performing these endless activities, in this constant act of preparation, the alchemist is preparing himself. So that alchemical literature is primarily hermetical initiation literature, a literature about the proper way of conducting the mental life. And in late Renaissance versions of alchemy, such as that of Giordano Bruno, the mental or psychological aspect is emphasized much more than the physical aspect. Bruno's primary theoretical works involve the way in which a magician or an illuminated man should order the knowledge in his mind. For Smith, cinema is involved in these very principles. And his greatest film, called Number 12, it's his 12th film, or sometimes known unofficially as the Magic Feature or Heaven and Earth Magic, draws from many sources. The collage work of Max Ernst, especially in the collage novels, such as Infâme sans tête or Un Sément de bonté. The Hebrew Kabbalah, which Smith is very familiar with. And Daniel Paul Schreber's memoir, the Denkwürdigkeit, einen Nervenkranken, what is translated into English as Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. And those of you who know who Schreber is know he was a Prussian Supreme Court justice who, at a certain point, became convinced that alien deities were removing his stomach every time he tried to eat, that they had set up the four courts of heaven in his nervous system, and he was hospitalized, and through his hospital experience wrote this quite incredible document, which Freud took as a classic of paranoia. And in fact, Freud wrote the longest analysis of Schreber that he did of any non-clinical situation. Schreber was not his patient. Schreber was dead. He took Schreber's book and analyzed it as a classic case of paranoia. And unfortunately, Freud's brilliant analysis of Schreber's book has cast a shadow, a tremendous shadow over Schreber. People read Freud and read what Freud quotes from Schreber, and Freud's incredible hermeneutical talent convinces them that obviously he's right, because Freud is very good in the Sherlock Holmes mode, and Schreber gets unread. Smith was exceptionally interested in the particulars of Schreber, and all of these sources go into his film. Now, I'm not primarily interested in the source material of film, except that in Smith's case, of course, behind all of these diverse sources, and the reason for the diversity of the sources is his sense of a theory of the universal character. That is, there would be something in common automatically between the system, any form of system building, the Kabbalah, Schreber, surrealistic novel formation. I will show you then the opening passage of this film, number 12, called Heaven and Earth Magic. Do you know if we're already ready on the 35 millimeter? Okay. Am I okay with the microphone now? Okay. Several factors are immediately apparent in this opening passage. First of all, you have this little man all the way through the film. He is the one constant element of scale. He's not an accidental figure within this curious melange of illusions that Harry Smith is making, though he doesn't expect. See, part of the theory of a universal character is the freedom to continually make illusion with the assumption that one need not know the nature of the illusion to be able to participate in its systematic construction. And he found this little man in a book published by Schreber's father, who was a very famous pediatric educator, called Medical Indoor Exercises. And the book shows thousands of exercise positions that can be done inside. Smith, with his fanatical precision, cataloged these for a year so that he can make, instead of exercises, various kinds of moving animation figures throughout. But one has this unchangeable figure, this one active fixed scale in a totally mutable space, so that there is a male principal who is continually trying to establish or bring together or make a coherent form out of a female counterpart. He's continually transforming her, brutalizing her, changing her, scrambling her parts in one elaborate process of transformation, which relates, of course, to the Kabbalistic definition of God as a tree of life, with a crown on the top and at the bottom a female principle, or the Shekinah. And the entire Kabbalistic tradition of the entire Kabbalistic history of the Jewish nation is the history of the loss or the wandering of the Shekinah and of the desire to bring the Shekinah back, or the nation back, into the formation of God. Well, in Smith's film, one has the blank black spatial field of the screen on which this one little white figure begins to move. And even here at the beginning of the film, you could see two kinds of spatial transformation. He makes continual use of off-screen space. That is, the little figure walks off to some amorphous space and can bring things on. In one particular interesting moment, he walks off to the left and walks back on the right, as if he could walk all the way around the screen. This is part of what is fundamentally the ad hoc nature of representation in this film, and that's essentially important. There is no real space defined. Any spatial situation is defined simply ad hoc for the moment, as if space could only come into being for this particular principle. Now, this kind of ad hoc representation is one of the fundamental signals of a certain kind of visionary literature. The most marvelous example of ad hoc representation that comes to mind would be Dante's Paradiso in the third canto. There, Dante, for the first time, is going to see something in heaven. And theoretically, in Paradiso, nothing is visible. It is a matter of a relationship of light to light. But the heavenly spheres condescend to make themselves visible to Dante. It's an ad hoc mode of representation. And in a tremendous poetic passage, Dante says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, what I saw was like looking at a white pearl on a white forehead. I mean, kind of Malevich image of the limits of visibility, like a white pearl on a white forehead. Or, he says, at that moment, when you look into a pool and you see on the top of the pool your own reflection, or the reflection of things behind you, and the pool is so shallow that you can see the bottom of the pool, and therefore know it's a reflection. He says, seeing things in heaven was like that. Only I, Dante, performed the opposite error of Narcissus. Narcissus, of course, looked into a deep pool, saw his own image, and tried to embrace it and drowned. So I performed the opposite error of Narcissus, he says, and he turned around to see what was being reflected. And there was nothing. And he turned in the other direction, and he saw Beatrice's smile. And she says, that's all there is. In other words, that the mode of representation is sheerly ad hoc because the nature of the vision transcends or moves beyond that kind of representation. And in Smith's film, there are these continual signals of the ad hoc quality of the representation. For instance, out of the sarcophagi comes a landscape which is clearly represented as a flat photographic illustration. Yet out of that photographic illustration is pulled a watermelon which suddenly begins to occupy the so-called real space within the film. At other interesting moments in the film, those of you who saw it this afternoon will remember that figures can cross the screen at almost any line. And then suddenly in the middle of the film, a gravitational field will develop so that they all have to walk along one line. If they try to go above it, they fall down upon it. Ad hoc gravity, manifesting itself solely for the moment of representation. There is another source, though, that isn't as literary as Ernst Schreber or the Kabbalah, and it is the cinema of Méliès. And not just Méliès, but that whole early cinema of sheer invention, of wonderful, elaborate invention, which is very dear and very important to Harry Smith. I'll show you a little excerpt now from a film on hydrotherapy, magical hydrotherapy. And I will return shortly after that to Smith's film. There they've got them back together again in Hydrothérapie Fantastique of Georges Méliès. What one sees in this film is a lot of exuberant fun with some of the possibilities of cinema for overcoming the limitations of stage illusion. And Méliès was, of course, first of all, a stage illusionist. But part of that illusion of turn-of-the-century theater is an immense love of machinery. One sees that elaborate hydrotherapeutic device with a clock in front of it and an immense thermometer coming out of it. And if one had more time, one could show other parts of this film in which that same character is pummeled by machines to try to help him reduce weight. It's all a weight-reducing story. Is squeezed in various immense and frightening contraptions. He is involved, as it were, in the encounter with that elaborate 19th century sense of invention, which was machinery and plumbing. Indeed, the cinema, with its little gears and its exceptionally awkward and fragile strip of celluloid, is one of the most magnificent products of 19th century engineering, 19th century mechanics, and the love of complication in those kinds of gears. What Smith does, primarily, is interiorize and raise to the category of mental and epistemological dimensions this kind of division and reconstitution of a being that is treated so comically in Méliès. Had there been another Méliès film in this collection, I would have shown The Melomane, which is earlier and even simpler, in which Méliès himself is a mad composer who can't even stop composing in his sleep. And at one particular point, in what might be a dream sequence, a staff, a G clef and a staff and a scale, I hope the English vocabulary for these things is clear enough, is it? Appears above his head. And as he runs around composing, we see him take his head off and throw it up. And depending upon the speed at which he throws it up, it becomes a full note or a quarter note, and until he has an entire composition of Rule Britannia played out with his head. That is, that this joyous, exuberant, and so-called primitive trope by which human physical activity is transformed into a model of aesthetic activity is one that Harry Smith has seized upon and raised to a very high level. Do we have the second 16mm excerpt? Okay, so here we will see the ascent of the female figure upward to what we might call heaven. So she is injected, after sitting on this dentist chair, a paradigmatic instrument of 19th century progress and torture simultaneously. After sitting on this dentist chair, she is injected and rises, and again suddenly Smith gives a new sense of depth. That is, he has this illusion of receding balls or explosions moving up to give that temporary ad hoc only sense of ascent. And as she ascends, suddenly the mechanism upon which she is ascending breaks up and it surrounds her. But the way in which the mechanism surrounds her is by forming above her the outline of a woman's head. She is contained, as it were, within the head. And equally, at the same time as being contained within the head, there is a simple optical illusion of a recessed area, a shallow theater in which she occurs. So here the mind as a theater and the mind as something being contained within the head is suddenly brought to focus at the same time. Smith is interested in, at another point, in correlating all of this material with the researches of Dr. Wilner Penfield. And in one particular note, as if to explain the film, he said, this film all takes place in Montreal in Israel. By that, he seems to have meant that it takes place within whatever realm the Kabbalah takes place in, and within the Montreal Neurological Laboratory, where Wilner Penfield, for many years, performed open brain surgery on epileptics. And Penfield discovered that if you took you can remove the top of the head with a local anesthetic, and there's no pain within the brain. And so by probing with a hypodermic needle, he was able to perform surgical operations and remove certain lesions that were causing massive epileptic hemorrhages. But in the course of probing, he would get sensitive reactions. Patient would be wide awake, had to be awake. Say, oh, I haven't tasted that cookie since my grandmother made it in 1942. Can I do it again? And he discovered, among other things, that the model of the human body in the brain is very curious, because in many places there are little human bodies. That is, if you probe one part, one microscopic area, you get the arm, and then another the shoulder, and then you keep on going and you get the head, and then the nose, and then the mouth, and then a little further over the ear, and maybe there's a foot on the end of the ear. You know, it's designed like a network pattern from all things, except there are curious displacements around the body, which he said, of course, which goes to prove that the Kabbalah was right, that Bruno was right, that we contain within ourselves any number of electromagnetic sensibilities. One of the most amusing of these kinds of allusions to the synthetic character of mental activity, which this film alludes to, was his claim that the central theoretician of cinema was Giordano Bruno. I said, I didn't know Bruno had written anything on cinema. Oh, he said, you read Latin, you ought to be able to read it. It's the book De Innumerabilis, of the innumerable numbers of worlds. And I said, I know of that book. How's that cinematic? He says, look, Bruno says there is no such thing as motion. In cinema, there's no such thing as motion, right? Right. There's an infinite number of worlds. Every world is just like the other except for one slight displacement. In one universe, my hand may be here, and the other it's there, and the other it's there, and the other it's there. That every individual mind is constantly zigzagging and choosing paths throughout these innumerable universes, and giving themselves the illusion of motion by moving so fast from one of the universes to another. Cinema is simply a photographic collection of different elements from all of the different universes. All of this melange of activity, of excess intellective illusion, which I'm bringing to bear on Harry Smith, doesn't illuminate the central character of the film. It illuminates the nature of the gesture by which an elaborately repetitive film, and by the way, in terms of all of the films shown today, if you haven't seen the films, you're at a tremendous loss, because in each of these films, the nature of duration and repetition is what is most essential. The films I showed yesterday and the day before involved scenes or episodes or certain constructed elements. They were not involved in length and repetition. But here, when one selects out of highly repetitive works, inevitably what is lost is greater than what is gained. So one hopes you have seen them. In any case, what one has is a series of transformations, seriatim, of a number of elements, so that an entire vocabulary is built up of the iconographic possibilities of these elements. And it is, in a way, a cinema of ideograms. And the metaphor of the ideogram is a metaphor that continually occurs throughout film theory in many different contexts. It is a series of combinatory elements, the different roots of which constitute the nature of a mind. And in this sense, Smith is close to the mental theory of Freud, or the mental theories in which Freud participates. That is, insofar as Freud talks about condensation and displacement, there are a series of elements which are metaphorically condensed or metonymically displaced. And what is important is not the element itself. What is important is not that you dream of a key, or that you dream of a keyhole, or of an aeroplane, but the particular path and route of these iconographic elements involves the will of the mind to represent something to itself. And of course Freud has very strict and rigidly derived paths of this will, which Smith himself would not admit. But what Smith does admit in this general theory of mentality is that there is a vocabulary of elements, which is very much like the vocabulary of shots in a film, and out of the permutation of these elements, thinking is the choice of a series of paths. What one sees in the various permutations in this film is the act of thinking, the act of substituting, displacing, condensing one form or another within the head, within the mind, within heaven, in the quest for an image, in the quest for a conclusion, which is necessarily always right back where one started. So I'm skipping over the entire development of permutations in heaven, which is an elaborate spatial temporal tour de force, and coming to the moment at which the figure begins to descend. Is the 35 ready as well? One whole fantastic area of displacement and condensation that I haven't even begun to mention, in fact I won't have time to discuss today, is the relationship of sound to picture, because what is happening on the picture plane in terms of these transformations is happening just as much on the sound picture plane, where at times the scream of the woman will be heard as she's consumed, or the cry of the cow as he's consumed, but just as often the cat will bark and the dog meow, and the hammer hit with the sound of a water drop, or waterfall with the clink, with the ring of a bell. It is a world of sheer transformation in which both the mind of the viewer is called upon to make syntheses and displacements, while within the model of the mind, those displacements are going on madly. And just to quickly give another allusion to Méliès's exuberant version of this, and again, I wish I had enough time to show both the beginning of the conquest of the pole and the end of it, but I don't, because in the beginning we see the elaborate flying mechanism that is made in order to fly the explorers to the pole. But here we are at the moment in Méliès's film, La Conquête du Pôle, the conquest of the pole, in which they approach the central magnetic point. Of course, as Smith would see it, Méliès's film emerges from the fundamental desire of man to see these things, to see both fabulous machines and fabulous monsters, and to see himself consumed by fabulous monsters and in control of fabulous machines, because they relate to some fundamental principle upon which the mind is organized. And that act of interiorization by which Smith makes out of a photograph of the Sanskritist Max Muller, who, as it were, consumed Oriental literature by publishing the sacred books of the East for the West, then consumes all of these figures. And in the last episode, which I'll show in a few minutes, he defecates them. He shits them out in a giant pile so that they end up back almost where they started. Now, the myth of the Titan, or even better, the myth of the Battle of Titans, the Titanomachia, became very important in the American avant-garde film of the late 1950s and early 1960s, just as it had once been very important in European literature at the turn of the 19th century, that is, in the 1780s, 90s, in a period in English literature clearly spanning between William Blake's Wars of the Interior Titans and Shelley's interiorization of the Prometheus myth and Prometheus Unbound. What had happened in the American avant-garde film, which was fundamentally committed to expressing interiority, and began in the 1940s in works of such filmmakers as Maya Deren and Sidney Peterson, in representing dreamlike situations and trance-like situations, moved on to larger mythic entities which constituted the war within the spirit. And Smith's film participates in a general phenomenon of this play between the individual psychology and the giants of the psychology, the monumental forms by which man comes to know his psychological demons and gods as an act of interiorization. I think one can see quite well how the elements of Méliès through these brief episodes, and one could go on for several hours with intercutting allusions between Méliès's films and this one film of Harry Smith, how the interiorization of what is so joyfully exterior in Méliès takes place. Part of the pleasure of Méliès, the sheer joy, is the exuberant exteriority. That is, it becomes comic. While in Smith's world, it becomes so psychologized that it reaches the realm of the terrifying. But here we come to the conclusion, then, of Heaven and Earth Magic, or number 12, as everything comes out of the bottom of the giant. Through the soundtrack, you notice, of course, that the act of defecation is collapsed upon the sounds of birth, or a child coming forth. And ultimately, out of this pile of junk, debris, shit, comes a new image of the mind that is a self-contained sphere in which the relationship of the woman to the man is suddenly reversed, in which the man is in the hands of the woman, and in which all that we had seen on the outside suddenly is inside, passing in superimposition. And as things pass and move within that contained sphere, it begins to radiate out until finally it breaks down. The barrier of inside and outside breaks down, the system breaks up. The elements become very explicit in conventional symbolical terms. That is, we have the numbers, the letters, the stars, breaks apart. The picture plane is reconstituted back into the ancient sarcophagus and carried off, and we are exactly back at the very point at which we began. Consciousness is a relationship of subject to object. The story of consciousness is always the story of the relationship of a subject to an object, the history of that relationship. Here, the elements of subject and object, that is, what is taken into the mind and what comes out of the mind, are confused all the way through. And this is part of the possibilities of animation. And one of the reasons why filmmakers like Smith were so long attracted to the graphic space, because there is no ontological authority in the animated film for the exteriority of an object. That is, a cut-out element is already interiorized. It has already passed through a series of transformations which have domesticated it and have lost that special ontological authority which is the essential quality of photography. Photography, to use the sign system that the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce first very brilliantly brought into use, is an indexical sign. Peirce talked about symbols, indices, and icons. A symbol, according to Peirce, is anything arbitrary. That is, that and that are symbols. They are arbitrary. That in a given convention, there's nothing that makes these particular letters more like that, or that particular shape mean unity. It's a purely conventional, arbitrary system. There are signs which are conventional, and these are icons. That is, we agree that this constitution of two lines shall have historical significance in certain contexts. That is, one put on top of a steeple. It is a relationship. It is a modified relationship to something presumably real and historical, something that existed in the world, a crucifixion at one time, yet it is conventionalized. There's no ontological connection between that and a couple of pieces of wood in Jerusalem almost 2,000 years ago. However, there is another kind of sign, a footprint. You see a footprint, and he says, aha, this is a sign that someone has walked here. It is not only a sign, it is an indexical sign, it is a proof. It stands as testimony, as does a bullet hole, as does indeed a photograph. A photograph is complex in that it is an indexical mapping of an iconic relationship. We learn to read photographs. We learn to see this flat relationship of black and white dots or colored pellicules in relationship to something we experience in the phenomenal world. It is a learned thing. There are cultures that cannot easily perform this kind of identification. Yet, in addition to that, there is this titanic seduction of the indexical, the sense that not only is this photograph an icon or representation of something, but that somehow it was caused by it. Now, a new problem for the representation of consciousness in cinema comes about: how do we domesticate as filmmakers ontological objects, objects that seem to have more authority than our cameras, things which come from the outside and crush themselves through light onto the camera? How can we make the mind stronger than that? If any filmmaker has faced this strongly, it is Stan Brakhage. And Brakhage is the high romantic filmmaker of the American avant-garde. And I have to be very careful of my use of romanticism, because I don't mean romanticism in the conventional term, but in a technical term. That is, that particular change in historical consciousness that occurred at about the time of the French Revolution, and for which there has not been a major change. That is, the historical period that we are living in, late Romanticism, the mode by which what we call modern philosophy derived, that is, Hegel, Romanticism has suffered many reversals, but it is part of the nature of Romanticism to seek for its own dialectical reversals. I mean, insofar as Marx claims to have stood Hegel on his head, he's a romantic. Marx is the great romantic economist. Insofar as modernism has attempted to obliterate the painting style of a previous century, that itself is a romantic gesture, even when turned against earlier romanticists. The romantic concept of art is a concept of struggle, of generation. It's the breakdown of a sense of tradition. It is not that from my workshop comes your workshop and you might add something or do something different. The great continuity of Renaissance and Baroque art breaks down with a war, the war of the young titans or the young upstarts who are continually reversing and obliterating the later forms. And we are within that romantic tradition. This said, the basic issues are I and the abyss. The world is only a temporary sounding board or mediating illusion between I and the abyss. Everything I see, I have projected onto the world. He says that the first circle is the human eye. The next circle that it projects is the horizon. That if the axis of vision were coordinate with the axis of things, we would see straight through. It is a mere accident that the axis of vision is polluted, perverted, and by a lack of coincidence, we don't see straight through. We are trapped in a temporary world of things. Of course, the danger of this philosophical system is called solipsism. That is the notion that everything that is relevant, everything that has real being in the world is me. And Brakhage is the filmmaker who most thoroughly confronted solipsism in cinema. I'm going to show you several excerpts from one of his early masterpieces called Anticipation of the Night, the film in which he formulated for the first time his relationship to the self as a visible field. Let's take a look at the first few minutes of this film. Well, if for Harry Smith the fundamental uniqueness of cinema was that the single frame is like an ideogram or element, and that the successive choice of frames giving the illusion of movement is a model for the constitution of the way in which the mind chooses among its impulses to invent itself. For Brakhage, the definition of cinema is light and shadow. Cinema is, for him, primarily light and shadow. The issue of the frame is not fundamental to Brakhage, that is the single photogrammic element. And here he confronts an image of self. He says, I will not have an actor in my film. The basic issue for me is how I can film the world as I see it in such a way that I not only show it, but I show the way in which I see it. I turn now to two brief texts from Brakhage's book, significantly titled Metaphors on Vision, which is indeed what for him cinema is. The filmic image is a metaphor for human sight. For Brakhage has reversed Vertov's proposition. For Vertov, human sight is limited, and the camera as a machine transcends it and collectivizes it and historicizes it. For Brakhage, the camera is the best we have of the putrid devices for imitating the act of open eyesight. He tries everything he can to make the camera do the work of the eye. And you have the text in German before you. I'll read it in English. It's very difficult to translate because Brakhage, one of Brakhage's attitudes towards writing is that in order to place a wedge between writing and film and not make one think that theorizing isn't about words, but about film, he writes in such a way that emphasizes the puns and the linguistic nature of his text. It says, imagine an eye unruled by man-made laws of perspective, an eye unprejudiced by compositional logic, an eye which does not respond to the name of everything, but which must know each object encountered in life through an adventure of perception. How many colors are there in a field of grass to the crawling baby unaware of green? How many rainbows can light create for the untutored eye? And then in an even more complicated text, he talks about the limitations of the camera. And here, somewhere, we have an eye, I'll speak for myself, punning, as English poets have for centuries, on Augen and Ish. Here we have somewhere an eye, I'll speak for myself, capable of any imagining the only reality. And here he echoes William Blake, who speaks of the imagination, the real man. And there, right there, we have the camera eye. The limitation of the original liar. Original liar, of course, is a pun on not telling the truth and on the musical instrument. Its lens is ground to achieve 19th century Western compositional perspective, as best exemplified by the classic ruin. In other words, that even when you buy a lens, you're not buying an eye, but you're buying something that has been, by common consent, constructed to produce a certain kind of perspective that didn't come into being until the Renaissance, and in the Renaissance came into being to give rebirth to something classical, which they only knew of as in ruins. Its standard camera and projector speed for recording movement geared to the feeling of the ideal slow Viennese waltz. You can forgive his Americocentrism at this particular moment. And even its tripod head, balled with bearings, to permit that les sulfide motion, ideal to the contemplative romantic, and virtually restricted to horizontal and vertical movements, and its color film manufactured to produce that picture postcard effect, salon painting, exemplified by those oh so blue skies and peachy skins. In other words, for Brakhage, one of the first fights the filmmaker must make is against the very tools he has. The tools have already been ideologically constructed for a socialized conception of representation. And Brakhage, as a radical American solipsistic idealist, believes art is absolutely and irreducibly an examination of the self. In fact, Brakhage, at least unconsciously, although quite deliberately, possibly alludes to the great American solipsistic poem of all, when he says, how many colors are there in a field of grass to the crawling baby unaware of green? That is Whitman's Leaves of Grass and the great Song of Myself, in which Whitman poses as the radiant sun which illuminates all that he sees. That is, by bringing his eyes to the field of vision, he makes the world visible. Brakhage in this film is involved in showing the way in which he sees the world. And he begins in the first person showing those parts of himself that he can see without the use of a mirror, that is, his shadow. So that he identifies both the self with the shadow, or the obstructing of the light, and cinema with the shadow and obstructing light. So that there is, within Brakhage's immediate theoretical prehension of his tool, a link between the theory of the self and the theory of cinema as representation. And so he goes out the door, questing after adequate sight, questing after innocent vision, questing after a world that is pre-verbal. And this is the great quest in Brakhage, of course, in Brakhage's early work, to recover from the visible world a plenitude before there were names, before there were how many colors there are before there were green. And Brakhage is not naive. He realizes that this is necessarily a failed quest. This, of course, is one of the classic romantic quests. But before going on, before defining the nature of the romantic crisis poem, let me show you one of the first encounters that Brakhage makes with parts of the objective world in this exterior quest, in this day, this walk through the day with his camera, which will end up being, as the title says, an anticipation of the night. Every quest of this sort, every attempt to find in the light an adequate image for the self will be in anticipation of the darkness or the night. In this brief episode, about a third of the way through the film, one sees literalized the issue of the crawling baby and the rainbow. But one has to take it a little bit slower. What is the fundamental gesture by which the filmmaker overcomes the indexical authority of exterior objects? Well, the first and primary gesture is movement. That is, by wrenching the camera from the tripod and by continually moving it, by intentionally questing forward and around and through things, Brakhage not only shows a thing in the same way that if he had a giant close-up of a flower, he would show a flower, but he is continually emphasizing his probing relationship to it. That there is no way in order, there's no moment in this film, not one, in which things are allowed an authority of their own, in which we can see a flower, a baby, an automobile. Always that moving, probing camera shows some relationship of the subject to that object. There is that intimacy built into it. That's not the only level on which it occurs. Brakhage continually and elaborately denies the continuity of temporal succession. This is an anti-metonymic film in that sense, that he continually cuts from the child on the lawn at night to the on the lawn during the day to the moving traffic lights at night, from images in one place to images in another. There is no attempt to allow shot A to appear to follow shot B because shot A was made just before shot B. In other words, that there's no fictional assumption that the order in which we are seeing the images is the order of their production or the order of some fictional act. There is a deliberate rupture at this point, and instead is substituted a purely cinematic construction. That is, movement A somehow relates to movement B, or color A to color B in comparison or antithesis. So it is a questing through a space that is doubly interiorized, interiorized by the movement of the camera and interiorized again by the movement of the editing. Now, what is, one has to, I mean, this may be very banal what I'm about to say, but one can never be confident of the degree to which one's audience has read poems. In America, I can be confident that they haven't. But the poem, the lyrical poem, since 1780 at least, has had one remarkably consistent form. It is a statement of crisis between the interior and exterior world. And it is not a resolved crisis. It is, insofar as the poem is long and has stanzas and allows itself any time to elaborate, it is the encounter of the poet with some idea, with something, his shrinking of himself in relationship to that thing, the expansion of intending to incorporate that thing or give it meaning or project himself onto it. And one finds this in all the major Western traditions consistently. I mean, certainly this is the Hölderlin poem. Certainly this is the Rilke poem and the Paul Celan poem in the great German tradition. Unquestionably, the Wordsworthian poem, the Shelleyan poem, the Keatsian poem, Poundian, Stevensian poem. It's the story of Baudelaire and of Mallarmé and of Valéry and of Ponche. Encounter with the thing and a crisis relationship developing within the language. And the nature of the crisis is not only psychological. That is, the poem not only records a psychological event or a deep personal loss, it identifies that loss as the very moment of creating the poem. That is, the place where that loss and encounter and pseudo-triumph is most important is within the poem. It's such a generalized statement it might seem, on the one hand, obvious to everyone, or totally obscure, or somewhere between. The crisis poem, though, is the fundamental story of poetic consciousness, the relationship, the probing for some image of the self, some impress of the self on a world which wants to impress itself upon the self. And interestingly, all romantic art, that is, the art of the past 200 years, has been committed to the poetics of failure, to describing in various ways the limitations of that quest. Philosophically, we have the great model of that limitation in Kant. Kant asks the mind, what Kant means by critique, by criticism, is he names the mind as the greatest power of the mind, Kant says, implies, is its power to define its own limits, to name its horizon. And so reason sets out to define its own limits. And critical philosophy, which is the most significant philosophy we have, which is the philosophy we have and everything that follows it, critical philosophy is the definition of limits. And romantic art has been that definition of limits, but not in a rational, architectonic form, but in a rhythm of probing, of conquest, of release, in a dialectical encounter of the self of the artist with what he experiences or sees or finds as other. And Brakhage is the clearest example in the American avant-garde cinema of this crisis lyric in film. And as he encounters objects in the world, he sees a baby crawling, and he attempts to participate in that baby's view, and of course he fails. He can come close, he can hold back, and this is one of the strengths of his art, one of the triumphs, is holding back the sense of objectivity, suspending for a while from us the sense of what it is he is filming, allowing us to see a pre-verbal moment. But once that moment crystallizes into a metaphor, say the child, for him, that metaphor is seen in all of its limitations. He pulls back from the child, it is objective, he cannot be that child. He cannot, with his camera, enter that child's vision, he can only be finding him. So the quest does not end there. The film keeps on going and going and going. And we'll see another stage of that encounter of the self with the other. In fact, the greatest crisis that the film faces, quite far into it. Anticipation of the night is dominated by three encounters with children. The first, the crawling child on the grass. The second, which I didn't show, of a Ferris wheel in which Brakhage joins in with his camera and tries to participate in the joys of the children. But of course, these are not his joys. They are the joys of another. And finally, the most pathetic attempt of all, when he sees the sleeping children, to suggest through montage the possibility of the child's dream. That is a frightening transformation of the animal world, these large birds beating their wings. And there is, of course, no possibility of entering the child's dream, of knowing the child's dream, or of entering any dream cinematically aside from the realm of fiction. Yet Brakhage attempts to move in. And the very style is an epistemological attempt to always to gradually add increments of knowledge, to go over the same again, adding and refining new things. That style comes to a certain extent from his reading of Gertrude Stein, who was a great master of the slowing down for epistemological intensity of event. I'll read you a little passage from Gertrude Stein to give you a sense of what I mean. The voice Helen Furr was cultivating was quite a pleasant one. The voice Georgine Skeene was cultivating was, some said, a better one. The voice Helen Furr was cultivating, she cultivated, and it was quite a completely pleasant enough one then, a cultivated enough one then. The voice Georgine Skeene was cultivating, she did not cultivate too much. She cultivated it quite some. She cultivated, and she would sometime go on cultivating it, and it was not then an unpleasant one. It would not be then an unpleasant one. It would be a quite richly enough cultivated one. It would be quite richly enough to be a pleasant enough one. So that no new element comes in this system, to an interior that has not already been over-prepared for it. There is no way. We begin with the shadow of a man seeing himself. sheer light and shadow. Gradually, the image of a reflection of a rose is introduced, but only into a context that has so thoroughly determined its own forms that any new increment is not a shock of exterior recognition. It is a new addition to the interiority. So that's what he means by anticipation, that the structure always anticipates something new but controls it as he quests after an image that will be adequate and, of course, never finds it. For Brakhage, theoretically, by the way, the nature of vision is at least threefold, or can be divided into three categories. He says that when we see with our open eyes, we don't see like a standard camera. It's impossible to see like a camera. The attention is constantly shifting. Even if we fix ourselves in a stare, we pay attention to the edges and the center. The eye is continually moving about and probing. And when we remember things or dream, the images come flashing at us. They don't have the fixity of solid images. They're hypnagogic images, and they dissolve and move away and are highly unstable. And even when we close our eyes, we keep on seeing spots and electrostatic imagery. And his cinema attempts to combine, through the camera work and through the montage, this tripartite vision, which is continually moving in the direction of attention. In other words, that the eye never simply sees. The eye is continually finding and defining itself through the act of seeing. And so we come to the very end of Anticipation of the Night, when all exterior sights have failed to give that one culminating image which he is in quest of. And we'll see what happens. It ends, of course, in fiction. Having told the truth as much as it could up till the very end, it lies. For a culminating image, it finds that fantasized element by which the self ultimately shows itself who it is: suicide. This is the self's assertion of power. In the doubling of the self, which is the apperceptive relationship to what you are seeing and seeing what you are seeing and knowing that you are seeing what you are seeing, comes only one moment at which something called the self can act in such a way as to have absolute conviction of its authority. Part of the perversion of this absolute conviction of authority is the high romantic myth of murder. One finds dominating any number of 19th century novelistic situations. But the ultimate one, the ultimate reflexive one, self-conscious one, is the act of suicide. So at the very end of this film, to find a culminating final image, Brakhage is forced to fictionalize. He's forced to show that this questing figure kills himself. But in so doing, he shows that the questing figure is itself essentially a fiction, a necessary fiction, what Wallace Stevens would call a supreme fiction, in order to get the construction going in which the very dialectic can occur. And so at that very moment, Brakhage wants to identify this fiction with the very fictionality of images in film at all. And as the consciousness wipes out, so does the image as it rolls out at the end of the reel, and it's just washed out in the kind of light that leaks into the camera at that end of the reel. There is that simultaneous moment of the identification of the very fictional transformation of the pellicule itself with this necessary pivot of fictionality within the quest for the truly epistemological film. That same element of a lie within an epistemological structure is inscribed in Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, of course, because every time we see the man with a movie camera, there must be yet another man with a movie camera filming him who is not thematically constructed into the film. Brakhage's own version of it is this attempt to show the limitation. Ultimately, it is a film which goes on a long quest, looking for an adequate metaphor, an adequate image for questing consciousness, and ends up defining its own limitations. Brakhage's influence was staggering in America. His theoretical power large. It was so influential that at a certain point in the early 1960s, a filmmaker began to do everything that Brakhage said was bad. Brakhage said, the filmmaker must handle the camera himself. Andy Warhol said, I push the button and go to the other end of the room. Brakhage said, the filmmaker must control every single frame of film, not waste a frame. Warhol says, let's see how much film, get me the biggest roll I can get for the camera. I'll run it as long as it runs. That it must represent the filmmaker's vision. Oh, he says, Jerry, why don't you do something in front of the camera? Warhol made a tremendous polemical attack against the aesthetic of Brakhage and his epigones, and created a tremendous revolution within the American avant-garde film. The first filmmaker to take the Warholian approach and to reintroduce into it the central epistemological concerns of the main tradition of the American avant-garde film. That is, the concern with the way in which film describes the paradigm of the mind, the way in which film is limited in that regard, and the way in which it has excess in that regard, was Michael Snow in a dazzling film called Wavelength, which took one standard Warholian trope, that is the fixed camera position and the zoom movement, and treated it in a significantly new way. I'm going to show you the, are we ready with, I'm going to show you the opening of Michael Snow's Wavelength. Now, it's going to be the longest quotation, it'll be about 5 minutes. It opens up flat, yellow, red. And then we get a very conventional kind of image. We see a room, and we hear live sound. This live sound has an interesting meaning. It's bad sound, technically. Bad sound is associated with realism in the conventions of contemporary cinematography, in what was called exceptionally optimistically once cinema verite. That is, this situation is so immediate, all you can do is put the microphone there live and you get the flush of sounds. It isn't studio. Studio sound, of course, would muffle out the cars in the background and the dominant sounds. But live sound has this sense of reality, the overwhelming of the microphone. Just as when you open up the camera lens, in comes the whole field of vision, you know, reality. When it opens up this film then with a classic, passive, Lockean model of perception. Tabula rasa film, and everything's coming in the microphone, coming through the lens. The exterior world is imprinting itself. The mind, well, the mind hasn't even become an issue yet. But whatever it is, the camera's receptive. It's passive. It's playing that exceptionally passive role. And people, and into this passive space, things are being moved. Someone moves in an empty bookcase. I mean, containing elements are moved in, but still we're not thinking about that. This is a realistic film. It's about, you know, something real is going to happen in this, obviously. And then the image starts to get unstable. Well, we can say that the bad cinematography, it's flickering, but still the dominance of the real is there. Nevertheless, in the course of the dominance of the real, the instability of the recording material vis-a-vis the real begins to affirm itself. That is, the light textures are not consistent, that the film is not up to this reality. And then the people come back and they close the window and turn on the radio. And suddenly we have a complete change of sound. Now, what is a radio? A radio is a machine that pulls waves, sound waves, electromagnetic sound waves, out of nothing, out of empty space, and condenses them into audible sound. A radio is a machine that draws from the amorphous space around, the unfocused space around it, and translates it, here translating it into language. And what is in one of the most amusing of all accidents I know of in the history of film, out comes this banal Beatles song about solipsism. And so how does the filmmaker respond to it? How does the camera? The camera listens to it, that is, it takes in the sound waves translated, and suddenly the image goes strawberry. It pinks out. Obviously, there is an intentional consciousness capable of responding. The mind, the figure, the filmmaker, whatever it is, this room, this vision, is capable at this point not only of receiving materials, but of being determined by what it receives. Strawberry feels forever, it goes strawberry. In other words, that there is latent some imaginative power within this model, some power of transforming that which it is passive towards. Let us consider an important pun. Camera. Well, the reason we call that device the camera is because of the prevalence of Latinity in the history of the device. A camera is a room. A photomechanism is a little box room. There's one important law about cameras, and that is, the photographic ones, that if you open them all up, you don't get an image. The light blends out. They have to be dark on the inside in order to see what is going on the outside. And in the course of this film, this begins to happen. That is, when you can see what's going on inside the room, when the elements of the room are visible, outside is whited out. But when the heavy yellow filter comes over, or when the room gets very dark, then suddenly you can read the signs outside. The room in which the film is being made begins to operate like the camera through which the film is being made. And let us turn now to this very articulate passage of Michael Snow's, which you have in German, which was the note he made for the film at its world premiere. Wavelength was shot in 1 week in December 1966, preceded by a year of notes, thoughts, mutterings. It was edited in the first print seen May 1967. I wanted to make a summation of my nervous system, religious inklings, and aesthetic ideas. I was thinking of planning for a time monument in which the beauty and sadness of equivalence would be celebrated. Thinking of trying to make a definitive statement of pure film, space, and time, a balancing of illusion and fact, all about seeing. The space starts at the camera's, spectator's eye, is in the air, then is on the screen, then is within the screen, the mind. And I skip down to the last sentence of all. It is a total glissando, the soundtrack is, while the film is a crescendo and a dispersed spectrum which attempts to utilize the gifts of both prophecy and memory, the gifts of both prophecy and memory, which only film and music have to offer. Those two phrases that I want to draw upon, the beauty and sadness of equivalence, gifts of both prophecy and memory. The beauty and sadness of equivalence is a very powerful description of the theory of metaphor. Metaphor involves its own limitation. The triumph of metaphor is it can show A as B. It can take of the ordered world and transform it, make A into B. The limitation of metaphor is that it is always aware that it has made A into B. Before you can have a metaphor, you have to already have conceived of A as not B. Metaphor does its work as imaginative energy, yet by being metaphor, automatically recognizes the failure of that imaginative energy. This is inscribed within the romantic theory of metaphor, which Snow, I think, quite powerfully and eloquently translates as the beauty and sadness of equivalence. And of course, we have a certain equivalence established between the camera and the room, between the machine and the room. It takes in the outside view through the windows at that point when it's dark to itself. And let us remember also that at the beginning of this film, we can see the movement pushing forward, but we don't know where. What occupies the attention at that moment as the central object of consciousness is the yellow chair. Being yellow and being placed against the far wall, it attracts its attention. What is above the yellow chair is something we can't yet see. And so the film gradually pushes forward. And after the women leave the room, the sound undergoes a transformation comparable to the pictures. Because instead of being live sound, suddenly we begin to hear an electronic sound. Now, what is an electronic sound? It is a sound generated by the very nature of the equipment used for recording. It is not a natural sound in the world, but a sound of the equipment itself. And as the electronic sound comes in, we begin to see the film in negative and in different colors and in superimpositions. So that the movement is from a model of the room or the cinema or the mind as purely receptive Lockean consciousness to a model of the mind as capable of generating its own material, as capable of looking at itself, as capable of listening to itself, and of the cinema and of the camera, the film, the recording instruments as capable of dealing with themselves, of making themselves their own material. And so we proceed forward until suddenly there's an interruption and a figure enters and falls on the floor. Very stagey. Stiff, stand stiff, just fall. The camera moves beyond. When that figure entered, night suddenly came on. It was the middle of the day. Suddenly it goes night. The camera proceeds forward, past the figure, and it's day again. So that while this one camera movement is continuing from one end of the room to the other, the time in which it occurs is now unreal. One has to postulate one of several things. That suddenly it became night throughout the camera movement, or that the movement stopped then, at that particular point, was continued in the night and begun the next morning, or that the construct of day and night is independent of this movement of the camera. So it becomes day again, and it continues day until the next human entry occurs. Let's see what the next human entry does. You noticed, of course, how you could see the signs on the outside through the dark filter, and then pop, suddenly it became night before the woman entered. And what the woman enters and does something that has not yet been done. That is, she is capable with her look of referring to the space that we have passed by. She looks around behind her at that backspace, and she goes to the machine, which is the reverse of the radio, the telephone. The radio had gathered in the sounds from the exterior world, these waves, and translated them to us as reception, and now she picks up a machine and translates her sound waves out to some unknown Richard. And she interprets what has happened. Through the act of interpretation, she invents a story. That person we had come in stiffly fall to the floor is now dead. The word is said, dead. The ultimate narrative word. Story begins when we can say dead, death. I'm frightened. And then interpretation begins. No, he's not drunk, he's dead. Outside world offers an interpretation. That is, the reflective activity has begun. And so she says, no, I wait outside for you, and out she goes. And the camera inches forward. That is, that intentional act is now separated from her presence. Yet, she recurs. The memory of that scene recurs, bleached of its color and occupying its original space. So we see superimposed the non-coincidence of the spaces. That is, she occupied space from a given perspective. In that memory, she no longer fits into the space defined before our eyes in the present, but that suddenly, in the juxtaposition of the two, we are getting apprehension of time more than the single frame. That is, the gifts of both prophecy and memory, which only film and music have to offer. A statement very close to the theoretical formulation of Kubelka that I began to analyze in the first of these lectures. That is, the way in which cinema prehends in two directions and attempts to enlarge the moment. Memory, prophecy, future, past, literalized here, but here it is memory. Here it is the way in which the film contains, having recorded it on film, the film has the possibility of bringing it back again. This cinematic possibility exists, and so as it goes forward, it is not like a stage event. It is a cinematic event which can recur. But in its recurrence, of course, there is a principle of difference. It is non-coincidence. It does not coincide in color. It does not coincide in consistency. It comes in flashes. It does not coincide in the very space which is superimposed upon it. Nevertheless, it is the model at this point for the interiorization of event, the interiorization of story, the turning of an event into memory from interpretation. And so the film now proceeds to its final denouement. Let me see if there's any. Okay. And I'll proceed towards mine. Now, this is all the more powerful, of course, when you've been waiting 45 minutes moving towards that still image. But just before it ends, when we finally find out where we're going, we're headed towards that picture of the waves, there comes this interesting moment at which the picture of the waves is framed on the wall, and superimposed upon it is the close-up within the picture. The camera is inching in the light superimposition and fixed in the distance. So here, in one spatial image of superimposition, is the image of prophecy. That is, we can tell where we're going. We see the future superimposed upon the past, the same way the mind does when it knows its directionality. It is there, but it is moving elsewhere. And then something wonderful happens. The move does not take place in terms of the camera movement simply. Snow only reduces the light on the framed image and increases the light on the close image. So that that final movement from the mid-framed wall to right in the picture is not a movement at all, but simply the change of ratio of light of one image to the other. One goes out and the other goes on. It zooms a little further and holds still. And here we are faced with the real question. One of the questions this film raises. Then, what is a zoom? This was not a moving camera film, and quite deliberately. Space did not move. What we saw all along was a series of zoom shots. Now, a zoom is a lens in which two images have relationship one to the other. It is a double lens system. And by separating the focal lengths of these two images, we create the illusion of movement within. So that everything we've been calling movement all along is simply the relationship of one static image to another static image. It is a series of ratios within the lens, dissolving the entire forward thrust intentional movement of the entire film. And what we are left with is a very interesting image. On the one hand, it is black and white. On the other hand, it is a flat photograph. So that where we had had a color movie before, now we are left with a flat black and white photograph. A metaphor for, of course, the nature of the cinematic image itself, which is flat. On the other hand, the flattest image in the film is unquestionably the deepest. For in one hand we had a 90-foot space, and now suddenly we have the horizontal sea. A sea which is both a metaphor for the waves of the sea, are like the waves of light and the waves of sound, upon which this mind or room has been defined, is to finally even take away this. He turns the front lens, which gives at first a movement of slight withdrawal, and then changes the relationship of these two images one to the other so that it goes out of focus. Going out of focus means there is nothing, pure light. It ends up at that moment in pure light. So what we have is a trajectory from a model that is radically passive, Warholian model, through a model by which film comes to know and define itself. That is, an idealist model of the mind describing its own activities, to a stage of sheer blankness, even more radical than Brakhage's fictionality. The fictional moment within the film is this fictional relationship of the voice to something in the past. That is, fiction is the way in which an event is reinterpreted. When the woman comes in and looks back, she fictionalizes the event. She introduces narrative. Because all we saw was a gesture of no more meaning than the gesture of moving in a bookcase, a person falling to the floor. It had no meaning. Fictionally, it does. And fiction is tied to the act of retrospection. So what we have in all three of these films, and with it, and these films describe the major achievements, although they don't include all, they describe the major achievements of the American avant-garde cinema, an encounter in cinema, an attempt to define the uniqueness of the cinematic in terms of the paradoxes of critical philosophy, in terms of the way in which an epistemological tool defines its own limitations, the way in which any gesture of getting a film going is somehow tied to the limitations of the range of knowledge possible in that film. It is an example, then, of cinema as a paradigm of human consciousness, but based upon three variations of the dominant model of human consciousness that we have been working with for the past 200 years. That's it. As usual, I'm later than I had hoped, and hungrier than I want to be. But as usual, I will entertain the non-questions. Perhaps we've become familiar enough by now that we could risk some. You know, this inevitable phenomenon. Are there any questions? No. But if I stand at the door, people go, I got a question there. And then comes the last day going out, the one question that would have made a difference. You know, the one, all week I've been wondering, but such and such. So please don't feel too inhibited if not only questions. I mean, there might be many objections. I've heard interesting objections, but only through, you know, you have to sit in the coffee house and hear your objections in Vienna. What scheisse, you know. He didn't know this and that. You know, this is it's a nice city. So, is anybody man or woman enough to ask a question? Yes.
I'm interested. How is it possible to talk such a long time? No? Yeah, in such an interesting way, in a way, about a problem which is to be done.
Well, see, I don't think that there is as I began my first lecture, that one thing we can be sure of, that the division of praxis and theory, which is one of the favorite anti-intellectual myths, is not true, and that one finds that the primary activity of film theory has been in the hands of the primary filmmakers. No, I don't like machines. What right do I have to talk about it? Is that what you're saying? See, I have this. I'm a compulsive, obsessive film viewer and thinker. I mean, I find myself compelled to ask the questions that when I read a little text and I see a film, I want to know what central source it comes from. And I've been doing this for a number of years.
But you do interpret your films in your own way.
I interpret them in my own way. Well, I attempt to interpret them in the way in which they are responding to other films. Not to give my personal... There's no such thing as a personal interpretation.
I don't talk about personal interpretation, but it's sort of a unique interpretation of the system.
Yeah, I would think it's very conventional. I mean, that really what it is what is amazing is how conventionally, how much the major films are in response to and along the axis of the major poetic statements of the past 2 centuries and the major philosophical views of the past 2 centuries. I don't think it's unconventional at all. I just think that there's a tremendous lack of seriousness in viewing films, which might make it seem unconventional.
So you're trying to tell your listeners to sort of get a different way of seeing?
Well, I would hope that they wouldn't think of films as a ghetto, and that they would realize that among the major intellective and humanistic activities of our century is filmmaking, as serious as philosophy or painting or literature? Yes. And now the problem is that as well as filmmaking, there's something called the art of cinema, and then there's something else, which is in every single cinema, called shit. And that what we take to be cinema most of the time is so banal that we lose our habit of thinking when we come across the real thing. I mean, that's one of the great problems. But that's one of the problems that something like this particular film museum is committed to the pedagogical activity of transforming. Not all film museums are. I'm not interested in all films per se, but there are achievements. There are real achievements. And those achievements demand the kind of attention that we give to any other cultural text, be it the same kind of care and thought and argument and disagreement that we would give an essay by Heidegger or a poem by Pound or a novel by Proust, painting by Picasso. Yes?
I don't think that breaking down one's system of perception has to be as painful to look at as Brakhage, for example.
Well, this question of pain is an almost sexual one. That is, I've heard it very often upon the first encounter with Brakhage's films. I find Brakhage's films, if anything, the unbearable direction of Brakhage's films is their gorgeousness. They are so beautiful and so melodic. But this is a question of adjustment. Just as the same argument has been traditionally used against Stravinsky, who is immensely melodic, that it does take a certain while to view films, and there is a physiological change that comes upon one when one has seen, when one has cleansed oneself of the conventional rhythms of film and are able to look at Brakhage. I find no pain at all. Sheer, I mean, quite the opposite. And what can I say? That I mean that by and large, in my experiences, public experiences of the past 10 years. This comes up continually. It seems to be one legitimate response, but it's a threshold which can be overcome, which people do overcome. It's not deliberate pain. I mean, there is not an aggressivity at all in Brakhage's art. None at all.
I was thinking about if it's true that one's eye moves the same way than the camera moves in Brakhage's films.
Yes.
It certainly isn't as painful. I agree with this point that it's very different things one perceives and that they are continually shifting perspectives and so on. But I feel that it's sort of enforced if you see it at
Well, your question has buried within it a very interesting observation. In fact, a crucial observation. Because if you say that when you see the physical world, the eye continually moves, then why not have a fixed camera position and let the eye continually move around that position? What Brakhage has done, the way in which Brakhage has introduced the self, is to overdetermine the possibility of those movements towards his movements. So that you not only see the baby, you see the baby mediated through Brakhage's mode of perception. Now that act of overdetermination of someone else's visual pattern on yours is what you were translating as pain. But that isn't, its intent is not to hurt you, but to suppress, for the moment, your natural wandering instinct and to make it follow his, because what he is showing is not a baby, but his sight. He wants to show his eyesight. That's what he wants to show. He wants to show his mind. But your question, I think, had within it, buried there, a central insight, a theoretical crux. There, no. Huh? Everybody wants to go home. Okay. See some of you tomorrow.